What happens when privilege meets justice? When someone who believes themselves untouchable discovers they've just crossed paths with the very person who can hold them accountable. This is the extraordinary true story of Amara Thomas, a woman whose quiet morning walk would become the catalyst for exposing an entire network of corruption and racism that had festered in plain sight for decades. Picture this. A spring morning in Crest Hill, an affluent suburban neighborhood where cherry blossoms line perfectly manicured streets and million-dollar homes stand as monuments to success. The kind of place where appearances matter more than truth, where wealth can seemingly buy silence, and where certain people are made to feel they don't belong. It's here the two worlds would collide in the most unexpected way, a collision that would ultimately shake the very foundations of a corrupt system. This powerful narrative centers on Amara J. Thomas, a 26-year veteran of the FBI's counterintelligence division who had dedicated her life to protecting national security. In retirement, she sought nothing more than peaceful morning walks with her beloved 12-year-old German shepherd, Kobe. But on one fateful day, her world would be turned upside down by an act of casual cruelty that would reveal the true character of those who believe money and status place them above the law. This is more than just a story about a hit-and-run incident. It's a testament to the power of resilience, the importance of never underestimating those around you, and the reality that justice, though sometimes delayed, can indeed prevail. Most importantly, it's a story that reminds us that behind every act of racism lies a person with their own power to fight back, and sometimes that power is far greater than the perpetrator could ever imagine. Amara J. Thomas had spent 26 years of her life in service to our country, though most people would never know it. As a senior counterintelligence agent for the FBI, she had worked in the shadows, protecting national security from threats both foreign and domestic. Her work required her to be invisible, to blend into any environment, to read people with surgical precision. These skills had become second nature, always scanning, always aware, always prepared. Born in Detroit to a family of educators, Amara had learned early that excellence was not just expected, but necessary for survival in a world that often questioned her right to exist in certain spaces. Her father, a high school principal, and her mother, a college professor, had instilled in her the values of education, persistence, and quiet dignity. "Let your work speak for itself," her mother would say, "but never let anyone silence your voice when justice is at stake." After earning degrees in international relations and cybersecurity, Amara had joined the FBI at a time when the agency was slowly beginning to recognize the need for diversity in its ranks. She had faced skepticism, microaggressions, and outright hostility from some colleagues who questioned whether a black woman could truly understand the complexities of national security. But Amara had let her results speak for themselves. She had developed expertise in cybersecurity, designed secure communication networks, and spent years tracking threats that most Americans would never know existed. Asterisk. Her career had taken her around the world, from counterterrorism operations in Europe to cyber intelligence gathering in Asia. She had testified before Congress, briefed cabinet members, and earned the respect of colleagues who had initially doubted her capabilities. But perhaps most importantly, she had learned to navigate systems designed to exclude people like her systems, where racism often wore the mask of professionalism, and where privilege masqueraded as merit. In retirement, Amara had chosen to settle in Crest Hill, a neighborhood that epitomized the American dream of success and prosperity. It was the kind of place where she had earned the right to live through decades of service, yet where her presence was often met with subtle questioning, looks and not so subtle comments about property values and neighborhood character. The racial climate of Crest Hill reflected a broader pattern found in affluent communities across America. While overt racism was rare, subtle forms of discrimination were woven into the fabric of daily life. Homeowners associations wielded policies that disproportionately affected minority residents. Local businesses provided different levels of service based on customers' appearance. Police responses varied dramatically depending on the caller's address and description of the problem. For Amara, these daily microaggressions were familiar territory. She had learned to document everything, to remain calm under pressure, and to choose her battles wisely. Her FBI training had taught her that the most dangerous opponents were often those who believed themselves untouchable, those who had never faced real consequences for their actions. Kobe, her 12-year-old German Shepherd, had been her constant companion for over a decade. Named after the basketball legend, Kobe had been with her through her final years of service, providing comfort during high-stress operations and companionship during long hours of surveillance work. In retirement, their daily walks had become a ritual, a chance for both of them to enjoy the peace they had earned through years of service. The neighborhood dynamics of Crest Hill were complex and carefully maintained. Wealthy families like the Ashcroft-Lells had lived there for generations, their influence extending far beyond property lines into local politics, law enforcement, and business relationships. They had created an insular world where their word carried weight, where their version of events was rarely questioned, and where challenges to their authority were quickly and quietly discouraged. Whitney Ashcroft-Lell epitomized this privileged class. Born into wealth, married into more wealth, and surrounded by people who had never challenged her worldview, she had developed a sense of entitlement that bordered on delusion. Her involvement in local politics and charitable organizations had given her a public platform to shape community discourse, often using coded language about preserving neighborhood character and maintaining property values, phrases that longtime residents understood as euphemisms for keeping undesirable elements out. This was the world Amara Thomas had entered in retirement, a world where her decades of service to her country meant nothing to those who saw only her skin color, where her intelligence and training were invisible to those who had never been forced to prove their worth, and where her right to exist in peace was constantly questioned by those who had never had to fight for their place in society. The morning of April 15th began like any other for Amara Thomas. Cherry blossoms were in full bloom along Maple Drive, creating a canopy of pink and white petals that danced in the spring breeze. At 7:30 a.m., she clipped Kobe's leash to his collar and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The neighborhood was quiet, with only the distant sound of lawnmowers and the occasional car disturbing the suburban tranquility. Kobe moved slowly these days, his arthritis making every step a careful calculation. At 12 years old, he was well into his senior years, but his eyes still held the alertness that had made him an excellent companion during Amara's final years of service. She had adjusted their walking routine to accommodate his limitations, choosing routes with gentle slopes and plenty of opportunities for rest as they made their way down Maple Drive. Amara noticed that construction barriers had blocked their usual sidewalk route. Orange cones and temporary fencing directed pedestrians into the street, with no reasonable alternative path visible. For most dogs, this wouldn't be a problem, but Kobe's arthritic joints made navigating uneven surfaces and curbs increasingly difficult. After assessing the situation with a tactical awareness that had served her well in the field, Amara decided to walk carefully along the edge of the residential street, staying as far from traffic as possible. The sound came first, the high-pitched whine of an electric motor accelerating far too quickly for a residential zone. Amara's trained instincts kicked in immediately, her head turning toward the source of the sound. A white Tesla Model S Plaid was cresting the hill behind them, its sleek form cutting through the morning air with obvious speed. Her FBI training allowed her to quickly estimate the vehicle's velocity, at least 40 miles per hour in a clearly marked 25 miles per hour zone. Time seemed to slow as Amara realized the Tesla was not slowing down. If anything, it appeared to be accelerating. The driver had clearly seen them. There was no other traffic, no obstructions, nothing to explain the car's trajectory except deliberate intent. Amara tried to guide Kobe toward the curb, but his arthritic legs couldn't move quickly enough. The Tesla swerved slightly, not to avoid them, but to ensure contact. The impact was quick and brutal. Kobe's yelp cut through the morning, quiet-like. A blade. The Tesla's brakes finally squealed as it came to a stop 30 feet past the point of impact, but the damage was done. Kobe lay motionless on the asphalt, his breathing labored, his eyes wide with pain and confusion. Amara knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she checked for obvious injuries, her mind racing through first aid procedures, even as her heart broke at the sight of her beloved companion. The Tesla's door opened, and out stepped Whitney Ashcroft Lell, though Amara didn't yet know her name. Whitney's first action was not to check on the injured animal or offer assistance. Instead, she walked to the front of her car, examining the bumper with the detached concern of someone inspecting a minor inconvenience. She was a woman in her early 50s, impeccably dressed even at this early hour, with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of confidence that comes from never having faced real consequences for her actions. "Do you know how much these brakes cost?" Whitney called out, her voice carrying the entitled tone of someone who had never been held accountable for anything. "You shouldn't be in the street." Amara looked up from Kobe, her FBI training helping. Her maintained composure, despite the rage building inside her. "My dog is dying," she said simply, her voice steady, but carrying an undercurrent of authority that Whitney either didn't notice or chose to ignore. Whitney's response revealed the true nature of her character. "You people just think you can go wherever you want," she said, the phrase dripping with casual racism. "This is a private neighborhood. You think walking some old dog gives you the right to be here?" The words hit Amara like physical blows. After 26 years of serving her country, after dedicating her life to protecting people like Whitney from threats they couldn't even imagine, she was being told she didn't belong in a neighborhood where her tax dollars and military service had more than earned her the right to live. Whitney continued her verbal assault, seemingly oblivious to the fact that she was speaking to someone who had spent decades analyzing threats and building cases against people who believed themselves untouchable. "People like you shouldn't even be in this neighborhood," she said, her voice rising. "You think walking some old dog gives you class? This is what happens when you don't know your place." As Whitney spoke, Amara's trained mind was working on multiple levels. She was memorizing every word, noting the time, observing the scene for evidence. Her FBI training had taught her that the most dangerous criminals often revealed themselves through their arrogance, and Whitney was providing a textbook example of someone who had never faced consequences for her actions. "I'll have my assistant send you a check for the inconvenience," Whitney announced, as if this were a minor fender bender rather than the deliberate injury of a living creature. "A few hundred should cover it. Consider yourself lucky I'm being generous." The casual dismissal of Kobe's life, the assumption that money could buy silence, the overt racism, it all crystallized in that moment for Amara. This wasn't just about a traffic accident. This was about a system that had allowed people like Whitney to operate with impunity for decades, secure in the knowledge that their wealth and connections would protect them from consequences. Whitney returned to her Tesla, apparently satisfied that she had handled the situation. She lowered her window as she prepared to drive away. "My assistant will leave the envelope on your porch," she called out. "I suggest you take it and forget this happened. People like you don't want the kind of attention that comes with making trouble for people like me." The threat was clear, delivered, with the confidence of someone who had made similar threats before and never faced repercussions. Whitney drove away, leaving Amara kneeling beside her injured companion on the asphalt, surrounded by the debris of shattered assumptions about justice and human decency. As the sound of the Tesla's motor faded into the distance, Amara remained motionless for a long moment, her hands gently stroking Kobe's head while her mind processed what had just occurred. The FBI agent in her was already building a case, cataloging evidence, planning her next moves. But the human being in her was simply trying to comprehend the casual cruelty. She had just witnessed the ease with Whitney had dismissed another's pain, the automatic assumption that money and threats would ensure silence. Kobe's labored. Breathing brought her back to the immediate crisis. Using her phone, she called for emergency veterinary assistance, then carefully lifted her injured companion, carrying him to the sidewalk where they could wait safely for help. As she sat there, holding the dog who had been her faithful companion through years of service, Amara Thomas made a decision that would ultimately change everything. Whitney Ashcroft Lell had chosen the wrong person to underestimate. The emergency veterinary clinic became Amara's command center for the next several hours. As Kobe underwent surgery for internal injuries and a fractured leg, Amara sat in the sterile waiting room, her mind shifting into the analytical mode that had served her throughout her FBI career. What Whitney had intended as a simple hit and run, with racist overtones, had unknowingly activated one of the most skilled counterintelligence operatives in the Bureau's history. While Kobe fought for his life in surgery, Amara began her own operation. 26 years of FBI training had taught her that the most effective investigations began with understanding the target's patterns, relationships, and vulnerabilities. She activated encrypted communication channels that had remained dormant since her retirement, reaching out to her former colleague, Calvin Ruiz, who still worked in the Bureau's cybersecurity division. "I need a favor," she told Calvin during their secure video call. "Someone just made a very big mistake, and I need to know everything about them." She provided Whitney's license plate number, vehicle description, and the approximate time and location of the incident. Within hours, Calvin had provided her with a comprehensive dossier. Whitney Ashcroft Lell, married to local developer Darren Lell, active in city politics, and connected to what appeared to be a sophisticated network of corruption involving zoning, decisions, construction contracts, and campaign finance violations. The first challenge came sooner than expected. That evening, as Amara sat beside Kobe's recovery bed at the veterinary clinic, her phone rang. The caller identified himself as Darren Lell, Whitney's husband, and his tone carried the same entitled arrogance that had characterized Whitney's behavior that morning. "I understand there was an incident involving my wife's vehicle," Darren said, his voice smooth with the practiced calm of someone accustomed to making problems disappear. "These things happen, and I want to make sure we resolve this amicably. I'm prepared to offer a generous settlement, let's say $10,000, to cover any expenses and ensure this doesn't become a larger issue." Amara's response was measured, giving nothing away while gathering information. "I see. And what larger issue might that be?" "Well, you know how these things can be blown out of proportion," Darren continued, apparently interpreting her calm as weakness. "Media attention, legal complications. It's better for everyone if we handle this quietly. I'm sure you understand the value of discretion." The conversation continued for several minutes, with Darren alternating between veiled threats and increasingly generous financial offers. He mentioned his connections to local law enforcement, his influence in the community, and his ability to make life complicated for people who didn't appreciate reasonable solutions. What he didn't realize was that every word was being recorded on a device that would meet FBI evidence standards. After declining Darren's offer, Amara returned to her investigation. Using skills honed during decades of surveillance work, she began mapping the Lell family's network of relationships, business dealings, and political connections. What she discovered was a textbook example of corruption hiding in plain sight, a web of bribes, illegal campaign contributions, and zoning. Violations that had been operating for years under the protection of local officials who had been thoroughly compromised. The next morning brought the promised envelope of cash, delivered by a nervous-looking young man who quickly disappeared after leaving it on Amara's porch. The envelope contained $5,000 in cash, far less than Darren had offered. Over the phone, but apparently deemed sufficient to buy the silence of someone they had dismissed as powerless. Amara photographed the bills, noting their serial numbers, before burning the entire envelope in her fireplace. The message was clear. This was not about money. The real struggle began when Amara attempted to file a police report. At the local precinct, she encountered Sergeant Palmer, a 20-year veteran who seemed more interested in protecting local power structures than investigating crimes. Palmer's initial response was dismissive. "Ma'am, this sounds like an accident. Dogs get hit by cars all the time. Unless you have witnesses or video evidence, there's really nothing we can do." When Amara pressed for a proper investigation, Palmer's demeanor shifted. "Look, Mrs. Thomas, I understand you're upset about your dog, but Mrs. Ashcroft Lell is a prominent member of our community. She's involved in charity work, supports local causes. I find it hard to believe she would deliberately harm an animal." The conversation that followed was a masterclass in institutional racism disguised as reasonable discourse. Palmer questioned Amara's version of events, suggested she might have been distracted or confused, and repeatedly emphasized Whitney's standing in the community. When Amara mentioned the racist comments, Palmer's response was telling. "Now, that's a serious accusation. Are you sure you didn't misunderstand what she said? Sometimes in stressful situations, people hear things differently." Despite Palmer's reluctance, Amara insisted on filing a report. The final document, when she received it days later, bore little resemblance to the incident she had described. It listed the event as an accidental collision with animal, and noted that no citation was issued. The racist comments were absent entirely, and Whitney's failure to render aid was not mentioned. The systemic nature of the corruption became clear when Amara attempted to escalate the matter. Phone calls to the police chief went unreturned. A meeting with the district attorney's office was postponed indefinitely. Even local media showed little interest in the story, despite the clear evidence of a hit-and-run involving racial harassment. But Amara had not spent 26 years fighting sophisticated adversaries, only to be defeated by local corruption. She activated what she privately called Project Swansong, a comprehensive counterintelligence operation designed to expose the entire network of corruption that had protected Whitney and her family for years. Working with Calvin Ruiz, she began gathering evidence that would meet federal standards. They obtained traffic camera footage from nearby intersections, documented the pattern of campaign contributions that had bought local officials, and traced the money flows that had funded years of corruption. Most importantly, they began building a case that would move the matter from local jurisdiction to federal courts. The turning point came when Amara made a decision that would have shocked her former colleagues. She went undercover in her own neighborhood, adopting the persona of Mara Jenkins, a recently divorced retiree looking for community involvement. She infiltrated Whitney's social circle, attending charity events, neighborhood meetings, and the exclusive brunches where the real power in Crest Hill was exercised. What she discovered during these gatherings was even more disturbing than she had anticipated. Whitney's racism was not an aberration, but a core feature of a community that had systematically excluded minorities through a combination of economic pressure, social ostracism, and political manipulation. The casual conversations at these events revealed a level of entitlement and prejudice that would have made segregation-era officials proud. The climax of Amara's investigation came exactly 1 week after Whitney had left her lying in the street beside her injured dog. Whitney had scheduled a major campaign event to announce her candidacy for city council, positioning herself as the candidate who would preserve Crest Hill's character and protect property values from outside influences. The event was to be held at the country club with local dignitaries, business leaders, and law enforcement officials in attendance. That what Whitney didn't know was that Amara had spent the week orchestrating the most sophisticated counterintelligence operation of her career. Working with Calvin Ruiz and a network of former FBI colleagues, she had gathered evidence that would expose not just Whitney's individual crimes, but the entire system of corruption that had protected her family for decades. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Avery Lell, Darren's estranged daughter, who had been disowned for marrying outside her race, had agreed to work with Amara after learning about the incident. Avery had access to financial records, campaign documents, and recorded conversations. That would prove the extent of the corruption. More importantly, she had decided that her family's legacy of racism and corruption needed to end out as Whitney took the stage at the country club, flanked by local officials who had been bought and paid for over the years. Amara watched from the back of the room. She had spent the week listening to Whitney's casual racism, documenting her connections to corrupt officials, and gathering evidence that would stand up in federal court. Now it was time to act. The campaign speech began predictably, with Whitney talking about preserving neighborhood character and protecting residents from unwanted changes. The coded language was clearly understood by the audience, who applauded enthusiastically at each barely veiled reference to keeping minorities out of their community. "We've worked too hard to build this community to let it be destroyed by people who don't understand our values," Whitney declared, her voice rising with passion. "People who think they can come into our neighborhood and demand special treatment, who don't respect our way of life, who bring their problems and their attitudes and expect us to accommodate them." The applause was thunderous, but it was about to be interrupted in a way that none of the attendees could have anticipated. As Whitney reached the crescendo of her speech, Avery Lell stepped forward from the audience, carrying a thick folder of documents. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Avery said, her voice carrying across the silent room, "but I think everyone here should know exactly what kind of person they're about to elect to represent them." The gasps that followed were audible throughout the room as people recognized Darren Lell's daughter, the family member who had been publicly disowned for refusing to conform to their racial prejudices. But Avery was not finished. "My stepmother, Whitney Ashcroft Lell, deliberately struck a dog with her vehicle last week," Avery announced, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "The dog belonged to a retired FBI agent, a black woman who had served our country for 26 years. When confronted with what she had done, Whitney made racist comments, offered bribes, and threatened retaliation." The room erupted in confused murmurs, but Avery continued, "But that's not the worst of it. What I have in this folder is evidence of years of corruption, bribery, and campaign finance violations. Evidence that shows how my family has systematically excluded minorities from this community through illegal means. Evidence that will interest the FBI, the FEC, and the Department of Justice." As if on cue, the doors of the country club burst open. Federal agents poured into the room, their badges clearly visible, their presence commanding immediate attention. The lead agent stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of the federal government. "FBI, nobody leave the premises," he announced. "We have warrants for the arrest of Whitney Ashcroft Lell and Darren Lell on charges of conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and violation of federal campaign finance laws." The chaos that followed was unlike anything the country club had ever witnessed. Whitney, who had been frozen in shock since Avery's announcement, suddenly found herself in handcuffs, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her. Darren, who had been sitting at the head table, was similarly arrested, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. But the arrests were only the beginning. As the federal agents worked through the room, several local officials were also taken into custody. The corruption network that had protected the Lel family for years was being dismantled in real time, with evidence that Amara and her team had meticulously gathered over the past week. In the midst of the chaos, Amara Thomas stepped forward, her FBI credentials clearly visible for the first time since the incident. The woman who had been dismissed as powerless, who had been told she didn't belong in the neighborhood, who had been offered money to buy her silence, was revealed as the architect of the entire operation. Whitney Ashcroft Lel, Amara said, her voice carrying the weight of 26 years of federal service. You are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise that right. The transformation was complete. In the span of 1 week, Amara Thomas had gone from victim to victor, using every skill she had learned during her FBI career to expose a system of corruption that had operated with impunity for years. The woman who had been told she didn't belong had just proven that justice, when properly applied, knows no boundaries of race or class. The aftermath of the arrests at the country club sent shockwaves through Crest Hill and the surrounding communities. What had begun as a simple hit-and-run incident had exposed a web of corruption that reached into every level of local government, law enforcement, and business. The FBI investigation, which expanded rapidly in the days following the arrests, would ultimately lead to federal charges against more than 30 individuals. Whitney Ashcroft Lel and her husband Darren were charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and violation of federal campaign finance laws. The evidence that Amara and her team had gathered was overwhelming. Recorded conversations, financial records, and documentation of bribes paid to local officials over a period of more than a decade. Both would eventually receive substantial prison sentences, with their assets seized and sold to compensate victims of their crimes. The ripple effects extended far beyond the immediate family. Sergeant Palmer, who had attempted to bury the initial police report, was arrested on charges of obstruction of justice and accepting bribes. Several judges who had been influenced by Lel money were forced to recuse themselves from cases and ultimately resigned from the bench. The entire power structure that had protected the family's criminal enterprise crumbled within weeks. For Amara, the resolution brought both satisfaction and sorrow. Kobe survived his injuries, though he would never fully recover from the trauma of the attack. The veterinary bills, which had initially seemed like a crushing financial burden, were ultimately paid through the restitution fund established from the seizure of Lel assets. But more importantly, the investigation had revealed the true extent of the discrimination that had been systematically practiced in communities like Crest Hill for decades. The federal investigation expanded to neighboring districts, revealing a pattern of corruption that extended far beyond a single wealthy family. The Department of Justice launched a comprehensive review of campaign finance violations, judicial misconduct, and civil rights abuses throughout the region. The case became a model for how federal authorities could combat systemic racism and corruption at the local level. The community response was mixed but ultimately transformative. While some residents initially resented the federal intrusion into their affairs, the evidence of corruption was too overwhelming to ignore. Community meetings were held to address the systemic issues that had allowed such widespread discrimination to flourish. The neighborhood association was dissolved and replaced with a more inclusive organization that actively worked to promote diversity and fairness. The Kobe Thomas Memorial Fund, established with proceeds from the asset seizures, became a powerful tool for supporting civil rights litigation and community development projects. The fund provided legal assistance to victims of discrimination, supported affordable housing initiatives, and funded educational programs about civil rights and fought community inclusion. The impact on law enforcement was equally significant. The local police department underwent a complete restructuring, with federal oversight ensuring that new policies and procedures were implemented to prevent discrimination and corruption. Training programs were established to help officers recognize and address racial bias, and community policing initiatives were expanded to build trust between law enforcement and minority communities. The story of Amara, Thomas and Whitney Ashcroft. Lel became a case study in criminal justice schools and FBI training programs. It demonstrated how a single act of racism could unravel an entire criminal enterprise when it targeted the wrong person. More importantly, it showed how the skills and training that FBI agents develop in service to their country could be applied to combat corruption and discrimination at the local level. The national media coverage of the case brought attention to the broader issues of systemic racism in affluent communities. The story was featured in documentaries, news programs, and academic studies that examined how wealth and privilege could be used to perpetuate discrimination. The case became a rallying cry for civil rights advocates and a cautionary tale for those who believed their status made them untouchable. For Amara, the resolution represented both an ending and a beginning. The woman who had sought nothing more than peaceful retirement walks with her dog had become an unexpected symbol of resistance against institutional racism. She began speaking at conferences and training programs, sharing her story and the lessons learned from the investigation. The transformation of Crest Hill from an exclusive enclave to a more diverse and inclusive community took years, but the changes were undeniable. Property values, contrary to Whitney's predictions, remained stable as the community developed a reputation for fairness and inclusivity. New residents, including many minority families, moved into the neighborhood, bringing with them fresh perspectives and renewed energy. The sidewalks that had been blocked by construction barriers were not only repaired, but expanded to include accessibility features for disabled residents and their service animals. The neighborhood that had once been marked by exclusion and discrimination became a model for how communities could embrace diversity while maintaining their character and values. The story of Amara, Thomas and Whitney Ashcroft Liel offers profound lessons about the nature of racism, justice, and the power of individual action to create systemic change. It demonstrates that racism is not just about individual prejudice, but about the systems and structures that allow discrimination to flourish unchallenged. Whitney's casual cruelty was enabled by decades of corruption and complicity that created a culture of impunity for those with wealth and connections. But the story also reveals the extraordinary power that can be unleashed when racism targets someone with the skills and determination to fight back. Amara's 26 years of FBI training provided her with tools that Whitney could never have anticipated: the ability to gather evidence, build cases, and navigate complex legal systems. Most importantly, it gave her the patience and strategic thinking necessary to dismantle an entire criminal enterprise rather than simply seeking revenge for a single incident. The transformation of Crest Hill from an exclusive enclave to an inclusive community demonstrates that change is possible, even in the most entrenched systems. It shows that justice, while sometimes delayed, can ultimately prevail when people are willing to stand up for their rights and hold corrupt officials accountable. For viewers, this story serves as both inspiration and call to action. It reminds us that every person has power, even when they appear powerless to those who would oppress them. It shows that the skills we develop in our professional lives can be applied to combat injustice in our communities. Most importantly, it demonstrates that the fight against racism requires not just individual courage, but also the systematic exposure and dismantling of the corrupt structures that enable discrimination. The next time you witness injustice, remember, Amara Thomas. Remember that the person being discriminated against might have more power than their oppressor realizes. Remember that change is possible when we refuse to accept the status quo and work systematically to create a more just society. Remember that sometimes the most powerful response to hatred is not anger, but the patient, methodical pursuit of justice. In the end, Whitney Ashcroft Lell learned the hardest lesson of all, that in America, justice may be delayed, but it cannot be permanently denied. And sometimes it comes in the form of a quiet woman walking her dog, carrying 26 years of FBI training and an unshakable commitment to making things right.